Arabella Hale's silk slippers hit the cold stone floor of Whitmore Hall so hard that the sound echoed through the empty corridor like a small, panicked heartbeat. She was running. A viscount's daughter, in full evening dress, at her own engagement ball, running like the walls were closing in on her because, in every way that mattered, they were. Behind her, the music still played. Violins wept beautifully over the sound of laughter and clinking crystal, and somewhere in that golden, candle-lit ballroom, her father was raising a glass to Lord Bertram Sloane, a 51-year-old man with cold eyes and colder hands, the man her family had decided would be her husband by morning. She had smiled through the entire evening, through the introductions, through the dinner, through the moment Sloane had lifted her gloved hand to his lips and looked at her not with warmth, but with the quiet, possessive satisfaction of a man inspecting something he had already purchased. She had asked for air. No one had stopped her from stepping out, and that was their first mistake. She had not gone to breathe. She had gone to find Felix Crane. Lord Felix Crane, young and dark-haired and soft-spoken, the man who had whispered things to her at garden parties and stolen glances at her across church pews, and made her believe, with every quiet look and careful word, that she was not invisible, that she was wanted, that she mattered to at least one person in a world that kept trying to hand her off like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She had made up her mind. If her father was selling her future tonight, she would fight for it the only way left to her. She would find Felix, confess everything, and ask him to take her away before the clock struck midnight. She had followed the sound of his voice to the east corridor, behind the heavy velvet curtain that divided the main hall from the library passage, and then her feet had stopped moving entirely, because what she heard on the other side of that curtain didn't sound like a man in love. It sounded like a man performing. "She actually believes it," Felix was saying, and the amusement in his voice was so relaxed, so unbothered, that for a moment Arabella's mind refused to process it. 3 months of whispered nonsense at garden parties, and the girl is ready to throw herself at my feet. Crane women fall harder than most. But this one is almost embarrassingly easy. The laughter that followed from his companions was low and cruel and utterly comfortable. The laughter of men who had never once worried about being overheard by the people they were laughing at. Arabella did not move. She could not. The blood in her body seemed to have forgotten how to circulate. Her hand was pressed flat against the cold wall beside the curtain, and the stone beneath her palm felt like the only real thing left in the world, because everything else, every memory, every whispered word, every look she had replayed 100 times in the quiet of her bedroom, was dissolving into something sharp and humiliating and completely irreversible. She had been a game. A foolish, lovesick girl who had mistaken a performance for a feeling, and now that girl was standing in a dark corridor with an engagement ring waiting on one side of her and ruins waiting on the other, and there was not a single direction she could turn that did not lead to devastation. So she ran. She turned from the curtain, and she ran deeper into the dark, away from the ballroom and the music and the men and the life that had never once asked her what she wanted, out through a side door and into the cold night air, where the wind hit her face like a warning, and the grounds of Whitmore Hall stretched out ahead of her, vast and black, and offering nothing except the mercy of distance. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop. And then she collided at full speed with something solid and immovable and unmistakably human. And the force of it knocked the breath clean out of her body and sent her stumbling backward. And two strong hands caught her before she could hit the ground. And a voice, deep and unhurried, and carrying the particular calm of a man who was never caught off guard, said quietly above her head, "Are you running towards something, or away from it?" Arabella looked up. The man holding her upright was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black so dark he had nearly disappeared into the night around him. His face was sharp and composed, and entirely unreadable, and his eyes, fixed on hers with an attention that felt almost dangerous, were the grey of a sky just before a storm decides what it wants to do. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet, with nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose, Arabella Hale opened her mouth and said the most reckless thing she had ever said in 19 years of careful, obedient living. "I need a husband," she said, "by tomorrow, and I will pay you whatever you ask." The stranger looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind her, the violins played on. And then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. "How much?" he said. "Are you offering? Before we move on, tell us where you are watching from. Just drop a comment." The stranger did not flinch. That was the first thing Arabella noticed about him. Most men, when a breathless, wide-eyed young woman in evening dress came crashing out of the dark and grabbed the front of their coat and asked them to marry her, would have stumbled backward or laughed outright or called for someone with a lantern and a firm grip on common sense. This man did none of those things. He simply looked at her, steady and unhurried, as though women proposing marriage in darkened gardens was an occurrence he had mentally prepared for and found only mildly inconvenient. "How much?" he said. "Are you offering?" Arabella blinked. Her mind, which had been running entirely on panic and heartbreak for the last 20 minutes, struggled to shift into something resembling rational thought. She had not actually planned this far, or the words had come out of her mouth before she had consciously formed them, pulled forward by desperation and the animal instinct of a person who has just watched every available door slam shut at once. She thought of the small leather purse she had tucked into the inside pocket of her evening wrap before leaving her room. She had been saving that money for 8 months, setting aside coins from her personal allowance, with no particular plan except the vague, stubborn conviction that a woman with nothing of her own was a woman entirely at the mercy of other people. She had £22 and some shillings. It was not a fortune. It was barely a beginning, but it was everything she had, and she held it out to him now with both hands, the way a person offers water to a fire and prays it is enough. £22, she said. And my grandmother's pearl earrings. They are real. A jeweller on Regent Street appraised them at £35 last spring. The stranger looked at the purse. Then he looked at her earrings, small and pale against the dark fall of her hair. Then he looked at her face, and whatever calculation he was running behind those storm-grey eyes, it was not the kind she could read. "That is £57, he said. "Yes." "For a husband." "For a legal marriage," she corrected, because even now, even in the wreckage of this night, some precise and stubborn part of her brain insisted on accuracy. performed before a witness, tonight if possible. I need it to be real, and I need it to be binding, and I need it to be done before my father realizes I have left the ball. A beat of silence passed between them, or the wind moved through the hedgerows. Distantly, from inside Whitmore Hall, she could still hear the music, bright and oblivious, playing on for a party that was celebrating a future she had already decided to refuse. "Why?" the stranger said slowly. "Does a young woman in evening dress need a legally binding marriage performed in the dark at 10:30 on a Tuesday? Because my father has arranged for me to marry a man I despise, and the ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and if I am already married when the sun rises, there is nothing he can legally do about it." She met his gaze without blinking, because she was terrified and humiliated, and had nothing left to protect except her nerve. "I am not asking you to love me. I am not asking you to live with me, or care for me, or pretend this is anything other than what it is. I am asking you to stand in front of a clergyman with me tonight and say the words. After that, you can go wherever you like, and I will never trouble you again." The stranger studied her for another moment, his gaze moving over her face, with the calm attention of someone who was reading something, and wanted to be sure he had understood it correctly before turning the page. Around them, the night was still and cold, and the torchlight from the distant entrance of Whitmore Hall threw long orange lines across the gravel path without quite reaching where they stood. They were in a pocket of genuine darkness, the two of them, which struck Arabella as appropriate for an arrangement that made no sense in daylight. "Who is the man your father chose?" the stranger said. "Lord Bertram Sloane." Something shifted in the stranger's expression. It was subtle, barely a movement at all, but she caught it, a brief tightening around the eyes, a flicker of something that might have been recognition, or might have been distaste, or might have been, both at once in a combination she did not yet have the context to interpret. It was gone before she could be certain it had been there at all, replaced immediately by that same composed, unreadable stillness. "And the clergyman," he said. "Do you have one in mind? Or were you planning to knock on church doors at random until someone answered? There is a Reverend Howell who owes my late aunt a considerable favor," she said. "He lives 4 streets from here. I have his address memorized." "Of course you do," the stranger said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite amusing but was adjacent to it. The tone of a man who has just revised his initial assessment of a situation upward by several degrees. "Is that a yes?" Arabella asked. "We will need a carriage," he said, which she took as confirmation. "I can get one from the rear stable. The groomsman there knew my aunt. He will not ask questions." "Then get it," the stranger said. "I will meet you at the rear gate in 10 minutes. She turned to go. Her slippers crunched on the frost-tipped gravel. She stopped without fully deciding to. "I did not ask your name," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not." She waited. He said nothing further, only looked at her with that same composed expression, and after a moment, she understood that she was going to have to live without that answer for now, or because 10 minutes was not a long time, and she had a groomsman to find and a life to save before midnight. She found Thomas at the rear stable exactly where she had hoped. He was a weathered, kind-faced man of 60, with large, careful hands, and the particular manner of someone who has spent a lifetime serving people who did not deserve his loyalty, and had chosen to give it anyway. He had driven her Aunt Prudence's carriage for 20 years, and received the news of that aunt's death with more genuine grief than anyone in the Hale family had managed to produce. He looked at Arabella now, standing breathless and wind-blown in the torchlight with her evening wrap half off her shoulders and something desperate moving behind her eyes. And he asked no questions at all. He simply readied a modest, unmarked carriage with quiet efficiency, handed her up with the careful dignity of a man who understood that some nights required silence above all things, and climbed to the box without a word. Two other stable hands, young men named Peter and Kit, who had been playing cards in the back corner, glanced up as the carriage moved out. Peter started to say something. Kit shook his head once. Peter sat back down. In some situations, even young men could read. The stranger was already at the rear gate when she arrived, standing in the dark with his hands clasped behind his back, looking entirely unbothered by the cold or the hour or the extraordinary circumstances of his evening. He stepped into the carriage with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being the most settled person in any given room, regardless of what that room contained, settled himself across from her, and the carriage moved out into the London streets. Arabella sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back very straight, and her heart beating so loudly in her own ears that she was almost certain he could hear it if the carriage happened to go quiet. It did not stay quiet. "You should know," she said, after they had travelled 2 streets in complete silence, "that I am not unstable. I understand how this looks. I understand that a rational person does not run out of balls and propose marriage to a stranger in the dark. But my situation is not one where rational options have survived, and I would rather do something that looks reckless and actually works than do something sensible and end up owned by a man who looks at me the way Lord Sloane looks at things he has grown tired of before he has even finished acquiring them." The stranger looked at her across the dim interior of the carriage. A small lamp was fixed to the wall above his left shoulder, and it threw warm, unsteady light across the sharp planes of his face. He was younger than she had initially registered, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of face that had been made to be taken seriously, and had never been given cause to question whether it was succeeding. "I am not questioning your rationality," he said. "You are very quiet for a man who has just agreed to marry someone he met 4 minutes ago." "I am thinking." "About what?" "About Bertram Sloane," he said, and something in his voice when he said that name made Arabella go very still. It was not the tone of a man idly curious about a stranger's domestic situation. It was the tone of a man for whom that name carried specific, personal weight, the kind that had been sitting somewhere undisturbed for a long time, waiting for a moment in which it became relevant again. She wanted to ask. She looked at his face and decided, with the instinct of someone who has learned to read silences the way other people read words, that this was not the right moment. She filed it away instead, in the back of her mind, where she kept things that mattered and required patience. "Tell me about the ceremony," he said. "What exactly does Reverend Howell know?" "He knows my name and my aunt's name, and that the favour my aunt did for him was significant enough that he has never forgotten it, and almost certainly never will," she said. "He does not know why I need the ceremony tonight. I did not explain it when I sent word last week." The stranger's eyes sharpened slightly. "You sent word last week." "I have been planning an exit for 3 months," she said calmly. I did not know what form it would take. I only knew I needed one. Reverend Howell was one of several arrangements I made in advance. You are the only one I did not plan. He was quiet for a moment. What were the others? I have a small amount of money saved, and I know the address of a respectable lodging house in Kensington that takes female residents without requiring a male guarantor. I have a letter of introduction from my aunt's friend, a Mrs. Daphne Larkin, who runs a small school in Bath and offered me a teaching position 18 months ago that my father would not permit me to accept. She paused. I was going to disappear. The marriage was a last resort. I had not imagined I would find someone willing on the same night I needed them. And yet here we are, he said. And yet here we are, she agreed. They arrived at Reverend Howell's house on a narrow, gas-lit street where the buildings leaned slightly toward each other across the road, as though they had been sharing the same secret for a very long time. The Reverend answered the door himself after 2 knocks, and in his dressing gown and spectacles, with ink on his fingers, and the look of a man who had been awake by choice before they arrived, and was now performing the ritual of pretending he had not. He was small and flustered, and genuinely kind, the sort of person who makes the world fractionally better simply by existing in it. And he looked at Arabella with the warm, sad recognition of a man who had known her aunt and understood, without being told, that whatever was happening tonight had its roots in something serious. He looked at the stranger with something different, something careful, the look of a man whose mind has just produced a recognition he is not entirely certain he should acknowledge out loud. "Your name, sir?" he said, pen hovering over the register. "Cavendish," the stranger said. "Dr. Nathaniel Cavendish." Reverend Howell wrote it down. His pen paused for one fraction of a second, the smallest possible hesitation, barely long enough to be noticed by someone who was not already watching for exactly that kind of reaction. Then he continued writing, and the ceremony began. It was not long. It was not decorated with anything except candlelight, and the sound of the wind pressing against the parlor windows, and the distant, occasional noise of a carriage passing on the street outside. Arabella stood in her evening dress on a worn carpet, surrounded by someone else's furniture and someone else's books, and said words she had heard at other people's weddings, and had never once imagined saying this way, in this room, to this man. She said them clearly. She did not stumble. He said them clearly, too. His voice was low and entirely steady, and didn't waver at any point, and she had the strange, disorienting sensation of feeling 2 contradictory things simultaneously. She felt terrified because she didn't know this man, and she had just legally bound herself to him. And underneath the terror, buried but real, she felt something that was almost like relief. The particular relief of a door closing on something unbearable, even if the room she had stepped into was completely unknown. Reverend Howell signed the register. He handed them each a copy. He looked between them with the expression of a man who had many questions, and had, with considerable wisdom, decided not to ask a single one tonight. He did shake the stranger's hand for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary, and his eyes, when he did it, were full of something unspoken that landed in the room without explanation, and remained there after they left. Outside, Arabella stood on the narrow front step and looked at the paper in her hands. She was married to Nathaniel Cavendish, who was already walking back toward the carriage as though they had just completed a minor but satisfactory administrative transaction and was now ready to move on to the next item on the evening's agenda. "Mr. Cavendish," she called after him. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it genuinely and completely. You did not have to agree, and I will not forget it." He looked at her for a moment in the gaslight, and something in his expression moved. Not much, but enough that she registered it as real. "Get some sleep," he said quietly, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Mrs. Cavendish." Thomas drove her back to Whitmore Hall without a word. She slipped in through the side entrance, climbed the servants' stair, past the landing where she could still hear the last of the ball winding down below, laughter becoming tired, music slowing into its final measures, and reached her room without being seen by anyone who mattered. She sat on the edge of her bed with the marriage certificate in her lap, still in her evening dress, still wearing her grandmother's earrings, and she stared at the name written there in Reverend Howell's careful hand. Nathaniel Cavendish. She turned it over in her mind, looking for something to catch on, some edge of recognition, some thread that would tell her who he was, or where he had come from, or why the Reverend's pen had done that small, telling thing when he wrote that name. She found nothing. She was exhausted and hollow, and operating on the very last thin reserves of a night that had taken every good thing she believed about her life and replaced them with something she had not yet had time to understand. She lay back on the bed. She did not change. She did not blow out the candle. She was asleep before the flame had stopped moving. The morning arrived the way disasters usually do, louder than expected, and far too early. Arabella heard her bedroom door open at 7, followed by the sharp intake of breath that meant her mother had entered, and immediately registered that something was wrong, and then the particular weighted silence that follows a woman who has rehearsed her opening speech so many times that the actual moment of delivery has temporarily short-circuited her ability to begin. "You're still in your dress," Lady Hale said at last. "I fell asleep," Arabella said, which was completely true and conveyed almost nothing. Lady Hale moved into the room with the brisk, tightly controlled energy of a woman managing a crisis she had not yet decided to acknowledge publicly. She was a handsome woman in her middle 40s, with Arabella's dark eyes, and none of Arabella's inclination to use them to look directly at inconvenient truths. She had married sensibly, and spent 20 years calling it happiness, and had been doing it long enough that she had almost entirely stopped being able to tell the difference between the word and the feeling it was meant to describe. She straightened a vase on the dressing table that did not need straightening. She moved to the window and looked out at the grey morning, as though the garden contained an answer she had not yet located. "Your father wishes to speak with you before breakfast," she said. "Lord Sloane's solicitor arrives at 9. The contract requires your signature." "It will not get it," Arabella said. Her mother turned very slowly. "I beg your pardon." "I am already married, Mother." Arabella sat up. She smoothed her skirt and said it again, not with cruelty, and not with apology either. "The marriage took place last night. It is legal and registered and witnessed, and there is nothing in Lord Sloane's contract that can reach across it." The silence that followed had texture and weight and several distinct layers. Her mother's face moved through a rapid sequence of expressions, none of which were simple enough to name individually. "That is not possible," Lady Hale said. "I have the certificate." Arabella held it out. Her mother did not take it. She looked at it the way people look at things they are hoping will cease to exist if they simply decline to interact with them long enough. "Who?" her mother said, very quietly, in the voice she reserved for moments of genuine shock. "Did you marry?" "A gentleman," Arabella said. "His name is Nathaniel Cavendish." The effect of that name on her mother was immediate and completely bewildering. Lady Hale went pale. Not the gradual processing pale of ordinary shock, but the sudden, total pale of a woman who has just heard something that rearranges the entire landscape of everything she thought she understood about the situation she was standing in. She sat down, not arranged herself carefully in a chair the way Lady Hale always did, performing composure like a woman who had studied it from portraits. She simply sat, abruptly and without ceremony, on the edge of the nearest chair, as though her legs had made the decision entirely independently of her intention. "Cavendish," she repeated. "Yes. Nathaniel Cavendish." "Yes, Mother. Are you going to tell me why you look like that, or are we going to continue repeating the name until something changes?" Lady Hale looked at her daughter for a long moment with an expression that Arabella had never seen on her mother's face before. A strange mixture of disbelief and calculation, and something at the very back of it that might, under entirely different circumstances, have been the beginning of awe. "Arabella," she said carefully, "do you know who Nathaniel Cavendish is?" "A gentleman I met last night in the dark when I was running away from your engagement party," Arabella said. "He is the Duke of Ashfern," her mother said. The words dropped into the room like something heavy falling from a great height, and the impact of them spread outward through the air and into the walls and into Arabella's chest, where they hit something that felt very much like the entire architecture of last night, rearranging itself into a shape she had not been prepared for. She stared at her mother. "The Duke of Ashfern," she said. "One of the oldest titles in England," Lady Hale said, and her voice had taken on the slightly distant quality of someone reciting facts, because facts were the only stable ground available. "Immense estates in 3 counties, a seat in the House of Lords, connections to half the cabinet, and social influence that reaches further than that. He has been the most sought-after unmarried man in England for the better part of 4 years, and he has evaded every single attempt to attach him to anyone, but including 2 very serious efforts by families considerably more powerful than ours." She looked at Arabella with an expression that was still moving between its various contradictory components. "And you paid him £57 to marry you in a clergyman's parlour in the middle of the night." "I did not know who he was," Arabella said. "That," her mother said, "is the only part of this that I actually believe." "Does it change anything legally?" "It changes the legal consequences of everything that comes after," her mother said. "The marriage itself is binding regardless. But Arabella, you are now the Duchess of Ashfern. As of last night, you outrank every woman in this house and most women in this county, and your husband is a man that Lord Sloane would not dare to look directly at without permission." She paused. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I understand that I am not marrying Bertram Sloane," Arabella said. "No," her mother said, and the short, complicated sound she made then was not quite a laugh. It was not quite anything else either. "You are certainly not doing that." The conversation with her father was considerably less philosophical and considerably louder. Viscount Hale was a tall man who had once been genuinely imposing and had curdled slowly over the years of spending money he did not have and making decisions he could not sustain into something that was mostly volume. He stood in his study with Lord Sloane's contract spread open on the desk before him, and Arabella's marriage certificate in his hand. And his face was the deep, mottled red of a man whose assumptions about the morning have just been comprehensively demolished. "This is fraud," he said. "It is a legal marriage," Arabella said. "Witnessed, registered, and performed by an ordained clergyman in good standing. You are welcome to challenge it in court if you wish, but I would strongly suggest consulting a solicitor before you commit to that course, because the outcome will disappoint you." "You had no right," he said, and his voice was rising in the way it always did when he felt control slipping, which was a thing he hated above almost everything else. "You are 19 years old and living under my roof, and you have no right to contract any marriage without my knowledge and consent." "English law disagrees with you," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone in the room turned. Nathaniel Cavendish stood at the entrance to her father's study, with his hands loose at his sides, and his posture carrying the particular relaxed authority of a man who had walked into rooms that didn't belong to him so many times that the concept of ownership over space had long since ceased to register as an obstacle. Behind him stood two men, one of whom Arabella recognized as the kind of legal professional who is paid never to look surprised, and the other of whom was simply large and quiet in the way that some men are large and quiet, as a fact and not a statement. He looked at Arabella first. It was brief, barely a second, but it was direct, and it checked something, and it moved on, and she had the distinct impression that whatever he had been checking for, he had found it satisfactory. Then he looked at her father. "A woman of 19 may legally enter into marriage without parental consent under English law," he said, with the pleasantness of someone delivering information they have verified from multiple sources and feel no particular need to apologize for. "The marriage is valid. The register has been properly filed. My solicitor has already received copies this morning, so there is no question of documents being disputed or misplaced." He paused and looked at the contract on the desk with the mild, polite interest of a man examining something that he has already decided is not going to be relevant to his afternoon. "I am Nathaniel Cavendish. I believe you were expecting Lord Sloane's solicitor at 9. He is, of course, still welcome to come. He will simply find that there is nothing left for him to do here." Viscount Hale looked at him, the way men look at other men when they are doing rapid, involuntary social arithmetic, and the sums are coming out in a direction they did not anticipate and do not like. The red in his face went through 2 or 3 changes. Then something settled there, not acceptance exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has just calculated that the battle he was prepared to fight is one he cannot win, and who is now deciding how to exit without losing more than he already has. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice had changed entirely. The volume was gone. What remained was cautious and thin. "Lord Hale," Nathaniel said. He stepped into the room without waiting to be invited, and which Arabella was now prepared to accept as simply the way he moved through the world, and took the chair across from the desk with the ease of someone sitting down for a conversation they intended to finish quickly. He did not look at Arabella again. But she noticed, from where she stood near the window, with the grey morning light falling across her still wrinkled evening dress, that he had positioned himself precisely between her and her father, and that the two men who had come with him were standing in the doorway in a way that was not aggressive, but was also very clearly not decorative. She watched him talk. She watched the careful, exact way he laid out the facts of the situation for her father, not cruelly, not even unkindly, but with the complete calm of someone who knows that the power in a conversation belongs to whoever needs the outcome least. She watched her father's shoulders drop, degree by degree, as the morning he had planned dissolved into something else entirely. Across the hall, she could hear her younger sister Dorothea asking their lady's maid what was happening. She could hear the lady's maid, a practical woman named Mrs. Fitch, who had been with the family for 12 years, telling her firmly that nothing was happening and that she should eat her breakfast. Lord Sloane's solicitor, a stout, harassed-looking man named Mr. Pemberton, arrived at 9 exactly and was met at the door by Nathaniel's legal man, who explained the situation to him in the entrance hall in terms that were apparently clear enough that Mr. Pemberton spent only 4 minutes inside the house before leaving again with his contract unsigned and his morning thoroughly ruined. Through all of it, Arabella stood at the window and watched, and felt the strange, suspended quality of a person who has just made an enormous decision and is now living inside the consequences of it for the first time in daylight, without the cover of darkness and desperation to make the edges less sharp. She had wanted to escape. She had wanted out. She had wanted to put a wall between herself and Bertram Sloane and the life her father had decided she deserved. She had done all of those things. She had also, in the process, married the most powerful, most sought after, and apparently most quietly formidable man in England. And she still did not entirely know why he had said yes. That question, as she understood, looking at the clean, composed lines of his profile as he spoke to her father, was going to matter enormously. It was going to matter more than anything else that had happened last night. Because a man like Nathaniel Cavendish did not do things without reasons, and whatever his reason was for standing in a clergyman's parlour at midnight and saying those words, it was not £57 and a pair of pearl earrings. It was something else, entirely, and she was going to have to find out what. Lord Sloane did not leave quietly. That was the first complication of the morning, and it arrived at 9:30 in the form of a heavy knock on the front door of Hale House, where Arabella had been taken after the scene at Whitmore Hall dissolved into the kind of tense, poorly concealed chaos that aristocratic households specialize in pretending is not happening. She heard him from the upstairs landing. His voice carried the way the voices of men who have never been told to lower them always do, thick with outrage and the particular fury of someone who has been publicly inconvenienced by a person they considered beneath the possibility of resistance. "I have a signed agreement with Viscount Hale," Sloane was saying, loudly enough that the downstairs maid flinched. "The girl was promised. What has been done here is a deliberate breach, and I intend to see it addressed in terms that are considerably less polite than this conversation." Arabella pressed herself against the wall of the landing and looked down through the banister. Her father stood in the entrance hall, looking like a man caught between 2 very large pieces of furniture moving toward each other. Nathaniel stood slightly apart from both of them, near the door to the morning room, with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man attending a mildly tedious theatrical performance. Sloane turned to him. The two men looked at each other, and something passed between them that Arabella could not name, but could feel, even from the landing. Something old and unresolved, and considerably larger than one broken engagement contract. "Cavendish," Sloane said. The word came out stripped of any title, which was either a deliberate insult or the action of a man too angry to remember manners. "Sloane," Nathaniel said, in exactly the same tone, which somehow managed to be both a perfect echo and an absolute demolition. "You have no business involving yourself in this arrangement." "The lady is my wife," Nathaniel said pleasantly. "I find that constitutes a reasonable degree of business." "This is a scheme," Sloane said. His voice had dropped now, which made it worse rather than better. The low register of a man moving from outrage into something colder. "I do not know what the girl promised you, or what arrangement was made, but I will not stand here and pretend that a marriage contracted in the middle of the night by a 19-year-old with no guardian present is anything other than a manipulation." "Then do not stand there," Nathaniel said. "You are welcome to present your objection to a court. I have 3 solicitors who would find the exercise entertaining." Sloane's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Nathaniel to the staircase, and Arabella pulled back slightly, though she did not think he had seen her. Even from this distance, his gaze landed with a weight that felt intentional, the look of a man filing something away for later. "This is not finished," Sloane said. "It is, actually," Nathaniel said. "Good morning, my lord." There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to make the household uncomfortable, and then Sloane left, and the door closed behind him, and the entrance hall exhaled. Arabella came down the stairs. Nathaniel turned when he heard her step, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the entrance hall, while her father stood to the side, looking at both of them with the expression of a man who has sold a horse and is only now suspecting the buyer was wealthier than they appeared. "You did not have to come," she said. "You are my wife," he said. Sloane's solicitor would have arrived at 9. It seemed practical to be present. "Practical," she repeated. "Yes." She studied him in the morning light, now that she could actually see him properly, without the dark and the panic and the desperate momentum of the night before. He was younger than she had initially estimated, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of face that would have been merely handsome if it were not for the quality of stillness in it, the sense that every expression he allowed through had been consciously permitted. His grey eyes held the same careful attention they had held in the dark. And she understood now, with the benefit of daylight and her mother's pale face, and the way her father was standing very slightly straighter than usual, exactly what quality of man she had purchased for £57 in a panicked midnight garden. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You may ask," he said. "I will tell you now that I reserve the right to answer as I see fit." "Why did you agree? Last night you did not know me. You had no reason to say yes. Men in your position do not marry strangers in parlours for £57. "Oh, so why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man searching for an answer, but the quiet of a man deciding how much of a true answer to give. "I knew Sloane," he said finally. "Not well, and not fondly. What I know of his character is not the kind of information a gentleman shares in polite company, but it is the kind that made your request something other than absurd." He paused. You asked me to help you escape a bad situation. I was in a position to help. That is the whole of it. It was not the whole of it. She was almost certain of that. But she did not push, because she had asked one honest question and received one partially honest answer, which was more than most people managed on a first morning of marriage, and she had enough to process without pulling threads she was not yet prepared to follow. "What happens now?" she asked instead. "You will come to Ashfern House," he said, "my townhouse in Grosvenor Square. It would be inappropriate for my wife to remain in her father's house the morning after the wedding, and it would attract the kind of attention that makes everything more complicated. I have nothing prepared, no lady's maid, no trunk. Both can be arranged within the hour. My housekeeper is competent." Of course she was. Arabella suspected that everything connected to Nathaniel Cavendish, Duke of Ashfern, was competent, arranged, and already 3 steps ahead of the current conversation. She looked at her father, who had not spoken since Sloane left, and who was now looking at her with an expression she did not entirely know how to read. There was anger in it, old and familiar. But underneath the anger there was something else, something that might have been a very reluctant, very private relief, and she decided not to examine it too closely, because she wasn't ready to feel charitable toward him yet. "I will need an hour," she said to Nathaniel. "You have it," he said, and moved toward the morning room as though the matter were entirely settled, which, she was learning, was simply how he moved through most situations. She went upstairs. She washed her face. She changed out of the dress she had worn through the longest night of her life, and stood at her bedroom window for a moment, looking out at the ordinary street below, at the carriages and the pedestrians and the grey London sky, all of it completely unchanged from yesterday, while she herself had become someone entirely different. Arabella Hale was gone, and in her place stood the Duchess of Ashfern. She picked up her grandmother's jewel box, because the pearl earrings were hers and she was keeping them, and she went downstairs to begin the strangest chapter of her life. Ashfern House was not what she expected, and she was not entirely sure what she had expected. But it was not this. She had braced herself for grandeur of the cold, intimidating variety, for marble floors and towering ceilings, and the particular atmosphere of extreme wealth that announces itself by making visitors feel slightly criminal for existing inside it. There was grandeur, certainly. The house on Grosvenor Square was 4 stories of pale stone, with tall windows and an entrance hall that could have swallowed Hale House entirely and still had room to pace. But it was not cold. The floors were warm wood in the reception rooms. The curtains were deep red and gold. There were books everywhere, on shelves and side tables, stacked with apparent contentment on window sills. And the overall impression was not of a house arranged for display, but of a house that was actually, genuinely lived in by someone who used it rather than performed it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, was a capable woman of 50, with sharp eyes, and the professional warmth of someone who has managed unexpected situations for long enough that she no longer finds them unexpected. She welcomed Arabella without a flicker of surprise, which told Arabella that either Nathaniel had sent word ahead, or Mrs. Price had simply witnessed enough of her employer's life that a new duchess appearing on a Wednesday morning ranked somewhere in the middle of her personal scale of unusual events. Arabella was shown a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor that connected, through a sitting room, to what she understood were Nathaniel's private apartments. of the rooms were beautiful in a quiet way. Cream walls and polished floors and a fireplace that had already been lit, and she stood in the center of them and understood that she was going to have to find a way to exist in this space as though it belonged to her, when everything about her felt like a visitor who had arrived without being invited and was waiting to be politely asked to leave. A lady's maid named Fern arrived within the hour, young and efficient, and mercifully inclined towards silence. And by early afternoon, Arabella had been bathed and dressed and installed in the sitting room with a tray of tea she was too unsettled to drink when the first social call arrived. She heard the voices from the entrance hall, a woman's voice, bright and carrying and entirely unbothered by propriety, but ascending the stairs at a pace that suggested the visitor had not waited to be formally announced. The door to the sitting room opened, and a young woman of perhaps 24 swept in, wearing a deep amber walking dress and an expression of barely contained delight. She had red gold hair and green eyes, and the energy of someone who has received interesting news and has been physically unable to stop moving since. "So it is true," she said, looking at Arabella with undisguised fascination. "Nathaniel actually did it. I told my husband I would eat my bonnet if the rumor was accurate, and now I owe myself a very unpleasant meal." She extended her hand with the directness of someone who considered social preamble a personal inconvenience. "I am Diana Merritt. My husband is Lord Charles Merritt, or Nathaniel's oldest friend, and the only person in London he tolerates for more than 40 minutes at a stretch, which means by a certain logic that I am now your oldest friend. I am sorry about that. I have been told I am a great deal." Arabella shook her hand. "Arabella. Cavendish, apparently." "Apparently," Diana said, with a grin, and sat down across from her without being invited, which reminded Arabella so sharply of Nathaniel walking into her father's study that she wondered if it was a quality that attached itself to people who spent time around him. "Now, tell me everything, and do not leave out the part about the clergyman, because Charles says the man nearly fainted when he realized who Nathaniel was, and I need to know if that is accurate." "I did not notice," Arabella said. "I was concentrating on not fainting." Diana laughed. What a real laugh, unguarded and warm. "I like you," she announced. "This is going to be wonderful. Nathaniel has needed someone to unsettle him for years, and I see you have accomplished it in under 12 hours, which is frankly a record." "I have not unsettled him," Arabella said. "He appears to be entirely unsettlable." "That is what he wants you to think," Diana said, pouring herself tea with the comfortable ease of someone who had done it in this house many times before. "He is very good at it. The composure, the stillness, the whole impenetrable castle routine. Do not let it convince you. Underneath all of that, there is an actual person, and that person has been alone for a very long time, and is almost certainly in a complete private panic right now, which he is expressing by being extremely efficient about something." She tilted her head. "Has he reorganized anything since you arrived?" Arabella thought about it. "He spoke to the solicitors this morning." "3 of them?" "Yes." "Panic," Diana confirmed cheerfully. "That is how he panics. He becomes very productive." She set down her cup and looked at Arabella with an expression that was warmer and more serious than the bright chatter had suggested. "He is a good man," she said, simply and directly. "I want you to know that. I am not saying it because he is my husband's friend, and I feel obligated. I am saying it because it is true, and because I suspect your knight gave you very little time to determine it for yourself. He is a good man, and whatever his reasons were for agreeing to what you asked, they will have been the right ones. He does not do things without reason. Arabella was quiet for a moment. Do you know what his reasons were? Diana's expression shifted, barely, a small, careful movement. That is his to tell, she said. But I will say this. The name Bertram Sloane is not unfamiliar to people who know Nathaniel's history, and if that man was the alternative you were facing, then I believe Nathaniel would have agreed to your proposal for free. The door to the sitting room opened then, and Nathaniel himself appeared, stopping briefly when he saw Diana with the expression of a man who is not surprised, but perhaps wishes he were. "Diana," he said. "Nathaniel," she said back, in exactly the same tone Arabella had heard him use with Sloane that morning, and for one bewildering second she had the sensation that she had stumbled into a family she did not yet understand, but was already, somehow, standing inside. He looked at Arabella. "Are you settled?" "Well enough," she said. He nodded, a small, precise movement, and then said, "There will be talk by this evening. By tomorrow it will be in the papers. I want you to be prepared for that." "What kind of talk?" "The curious kind first, then the speculative kind, then from certain quarters, the unkind kind." His voice was level, factual, entirely without apology. "You are a viscount's daughter who married a duke in the middle of the night under circumstances that no one outside this room fully understands. Society will construct its own version of events. Most of those versions will be wrong, and some of them will be unpleasant. I wanted to tell you directly, rather than let you encounter it without warning." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he said, "I will be in the library if you need anything," and left. Diana watched him go with the fond, exasperated expression of a woman who has spent years translating a person for other people. "What he just did," she said to Arabella, "was his version of telling you that he is looking out for you." I realize it did not look like that. But it was. Arabella looked at the empty doorway. "I know," she said, and was slightly surprised to discover that she meant that too. The papers arrived the next morning. Fern brought them in on a silver tray alongside the tea, and Arabella saw her own name in the headline before she had taken a single sip. She read it standing up, still in her dressing gown, with the cold pressing against the window pane and the words pressing against something considerably more internal. "The mysterious Duchess of Ashburn," the column read. "Who is the unknown girl who has captured England's most untouchable duke in a single night, and what precisely did she offer him to make it so?" The implication was not subtle. It was not trying to be. She set the paper down. She drank her tea. She was not going to let ink and insinuation undo her before breakfast, because she had survived her father's study, and Bertram Sloane's cold eyes, and Felix Crane's laughter in a dark corridor, and she was not going to be dismantled by a gossip column written by someone who had never met her. But the words stayed with her as she dressed, moving through her mind the way unpleasant things do when you refuse to look directly at them. What precisely did she offer him? As though the only currency a young woman carried was her body, as though no other explanation for a man's choice could possibly exist. She was in the downstairs sitting room when Lord Charles Merritt arrived. which was how she met him properly for the first time. He was a broad, good-humoured man of 35, with an open face and the comfortable manner of someone who had never found a room he could not settle into. And he came in with Diana at his side, and the morning paper folded under his arm, and the expression of a man who has already decided the situation is manageable. "Your Grace," he said, with a bow that was respectful without being stiff. "Charles Merritt, I want to say first that I think what you did was extraordinary, and second, that half of London agrees with me, and the half that does not is simply jealous." "Charles," Diana said. "I am being supportive," he said. "You are being yourself, which is adjacent to supportive, but not quite the same thing." Arabella found herself almost smiling, which she had not expected to do this morning. "Thank you, Lord Merritt. I have seen the papers." "Pay them no mind," he said, settling into the chair nearest the fire, with the ease of a man who had sat in it many times before. "Nathaniel has been the subject of speculation for years. They have tried to attach him to half a dozen women, and he has simply ignored every word of it. He will ignore this too, and it will die down within a fortnight." He paused, glancing toward the door. "Where is he actually?" "I have not seen him this morning," Arabella said. Something moved across Charles's face, brief and considered. "He rode out early," he said. "He does that when something is sitting heavy on him. Rides until he has worked out what to do about it." "What is sitting heavy on him?" Arabella asked. Charles and Diana exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long to mean nothing. "Sloane," Charles said finally. "He came to his club last night, made certain remarks in front of witnesses about the circumstances of the marriage, about you specifically. His voice was careful but direct, the voice of a man who respects a person enough to tell them the difficult thing. He is attempting to build a case that the marriage was contracted under duress or deception. He has engaged a barrister." The room was very quiet. "He is challenging the marriage," Arabella said. "He is attempting to," Charles said. "Nathaniel's solicitors are already responding. But Sloane has resources, and he has connections, and he does not like to lose things he has decided belong to him." He leaned forward slightly. He also said something else. In front of 4 witnesses at the club, he said that Nathaniel had specific personal reasons for wanting to damage him, and that the marriage was not a rescue, but a weapon. Arabella set down her cup very carefully. "Is that true?" Silence. "Oh, Charles," she said. "That," said Nathaniel's voice from the doorway, "is a conversation I owe you directly." She had not heard him come in. He was still in his riding clothes, and there was a coldness about him that was not just the outdoor air, something tightly contained and carefully managed that she had not seen in him before. He looked at Charles with an expression that communicated something wordlessly, and Charles stood, and Diana stood with him, and within 30 seconds, Arabella and Nathaniel were alone in the sitting room with the fire between them and the morning paper on the table, and everything unspoken, filling the space like weather. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. That surprised her, the quickness of it, as though he had been waiting to be asked. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, not the withholding quiet she had come to expect, but a different kind, the quiet of someone organizing something that has been kept in disorder for a long time. "Bertram Sloane," he said, "ruined my sister." The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage passed. "Her name was Clara," he said. She was 20. She met Sloane at a house party in the country, and he was charming in the way that men who have practiced charm as a tool are always charming, completely convincing until they have what they want and see no further use for the pretense. His voice was level, but beneath the level surface of it, there was something that had weight and heat and had been pressed down for a very long time. He made her promises. She believed them. When she discovered he had no intention of honoring any of them, she had no recourse, because she had trusted him privately, and he had been careful enough to leave no public evidence of any of it. She died 14 months later. The doctors called it a fever. I have never called it anything except what it was. Arabella did not speak. She understood that speaking was not what was needed. I have looked for a way to ruin Sloane for 6 years, Nathaniel said, legally, publicly, in a way that could not be quietly managed or paid away. I had not found one. He looked at her, directly and without deflection, and this was the first time she had seen him look at someone without any layer of management between the look and the feeling behind it. And then a young woman came crashing out of the dark and told me she needed a husband by morning to escape him, and I thought that perhaps what I had been looking for had simply decided to find me instead. The truth of it settled over her slowly, the way understanding does when it is large enough to require time. "You used me," she said, not with anger, with the precise, careful tone of someone who wants to be accurate before they decide how to feel. "I helped you," he said. "What you asked was real. What I did was real. The fact that it also served my purpose does not make your escape less genuine or less deserved." He paused. "But you asked me for honesty, and I owe it to you. Yes, I had a reason beyond £57. She looked at him for a long moment. The man sitting across from her was not the composed, untouchable figure the papers described, not the impenetrable castle Diana had spoken of with fond exasperation. He was a man who had lost his sister and spent 6 years carrying it, and had made a decision in a dark garden that was equal parts calculation and something rawer than calculation, and she did not know yet what to do with that. But she knew it was real. "Clara," she said quietly. "Yes." "I am sorry." He looked at her, and something in his face moved in a way she had not seen it move before, something that was not composure and not strategy, but simply a person receiving a kindness they were not entirely prepared for. "So am I," he said. The fire burned between them. The morning stretched around the house, and Arabella thought that she had come crashing into this man's life, looking for an escape, and had instead collided with a grief that matched the shape of her own, differently formed, but equally heavy, and that perhaps that was not an accident. Perhaps nothing about this night had been. 3 days after the papers ran their first story, Bertram Sloane made his move. It came not through the courts, as Nathaniel's solicitors had prepared for, but through society, which was considerably harder to defend against with legal documentation. Sloane had spent those 3 days quietly and efficiently poisoning every drawing room in London with a version of events that painted Arabella as a scheming girl who had trapped a duke through manufactured distress, and painted Nathaniel as a man acting on a personal vendetta rather than genuine feeling. The invitation slowed, the morning calls thinned. 2 women who had sent congratulatory notes on the first day sent nothing further. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the specific, suffocating social pressure that the English upper class had perfected over centuries, the withdrawal of warmth so gradual and so total that by the time you felt cold, you could no longer identify the moment it had begun. Arabella felt it. She was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. She was sitting in the library on the fourth morning, working through a correspondence she had been putting off, when she found the letter at the bottom of the stack. It was not addressed in a hand she recognized. It was brief, unsigned, and it said simply, "He married you to destroy, Sloane. When that is done, you will find yourself very much alone. Ask him about the Ashburn succession and what he requires from a wife. Then decide how safe you truly are." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and sat with it the way you sit with something you know is designed to hurt you, but cannot immediately dismiss it. Or she did not hear Nathaniel come in. He moved quietly for a large man, which she had noticed before and was beginning to suspect was deliberate. "What is that?" he said, from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She turned and held it out without speaking. He took it, read it, and his expression did not change in any dramatic way, but she watched his jaw tighten by the smallest degree, and his eyes go very still, the stillness of someone controlling something that would otherwise move. "Who sent this?" she said. "Sloane," he said, "or someone acting for him. This is what he does when the legal route closes. He goes personal." He folded the letter. "He wants you frightened. He wants distance between us because a united front is harder to attack than a divided one." "I'm not frightened," she said, which was mostly true. "But I would like you to answer the question he wants me to ask." He looked at her. "The succession," she said evenly. "What do you require from a wife?" He set the letter on the table and sat down across from her, and she noticed that he was doing the thing she had come to recognize as his version of being honest, the deliberate setting aside of the composure he wore like armor, the conscious decision to be seen. "The title requires an heir," he said. "That is a fact of the dukedom, and I will not pretend it is not. But I want to be very clear with you about something." He looked at her with the directness that had characterized every honest thing he had said to her. "I did not marry you to produce one on a schedule. I did not marry you as a transaction. What began as a practical arrangement in a dark garden has become something I find myself considerably less practical about than I expected, and I would rather tell you that plainly than let an anonymous letter do it for me in the worst possible way." The room was very quiet. "Less practical," she repeated. "Yes." "You're going to have to be more specific than that," she said. "You are very good at saying almost everything and leaving the most important word out." Something shifted in his expression, and for the first time since she had known him, which was admittedly only 4 days, but felt considerably longer in the way that intense circumstances compress and expand time, she saw something that was not managed or measured. It was warmer than that and considerably less certain, and it looked on a face that was usually so composed and almost startling. "I find myself thinking about you," he said, "in the spaces between things. When I am riding. When I am in a meeting, I should be attending. When I wake in the morning and the house sounds different than it did a week ago. And I understand that the difference is you." He paused. "That is not practical. That is something else entirely, and I am aware it is too soon to say it, and I am saying it anyway because you asked me to be specific. Arabella looked at him for a long moment. 4 days ago, she had been running through a dark corridor with her heart broken and her future stolen, and nothing left except velocity and desperation. She had crashed into a stranger and offered him everything she had, which was £57 and a pair of pearl earrings, and a problem she did not know how to solve alone. For she had not known his name. She had not known his title. She had not known that underneath the composure and the power and the danger that London attributed to him like a permanent weather condition, there was a man who had been grieving quietly for 6 years and had recognized something in her desperation that rhymed with his own. She had not known any of it, and yet here she was. "Sloane is not finished," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He is not." What are we going to do about him? The "we" was deliberate. She watched him hear it, watched the word land somewhere behind his eyes, and settle there with a weight that was not heavy, but anchoring. "Together," he said, "we are considerably harder to damage than either of us alone. His entire strategy depends on separating us, on making you doubt me and making society doubt you. If we refuse to separate, his strategy has nothing to work with." "And beyond the strategy," she said, "when Sloane is dealt with, and the papers have found someone else to write about, and the drawing rooms have warmed again. What are we then?" He looked at her steadily. "What would you like us to be?" It was the first time he had asked her what she wanted. Not assumed, not arranged, not efficiently managed. Asked. She thought about her mother, who had married sensibly and spent 20 years calling it happiness. She thought about Felix Crane, laughing behind a curtain at a girl who had trusted him with something real. She thought about her father, raising a glass to a future she had never agreed to, and about herself running through the dark, convinced she had lost everything. She had not lost everything. She had lost the things that were never truly hers: the false love, the managed future, the carefully constructed life that had been designed for someone else's convenience. And in losing them, she had run straight into something she had not planned and could not control and did not entirely understand yet, but which felt, with increasing certainty, like the first true thing that had ever happened to her. "I would like us to be honest with each other," she said. "I would like us to keep being what we have been these 4 days, which is two people who tell each other the difficult thing instead of the comfortable one." She met his gaze without looking away. "And I would like to see where that goes, without a schedule and without a transaction, just honestly." He looked at her for a moment that stretched long and warm and entirely unmanaged. "That," he said quietly, "I can do." Outside, London carried on in its loud, indifferent way. The papers would run more stories. Sloane would press harder before he fell, and he would fall, because Nathaniel Cavendish did not begin things he did not finish, and Arabella Hale did not run from things she had decided to face. The drawing rooms would warm again, slowly and then all at once, because a duke and his unexpected duchess presented a story that society could not resist for long. But none of that was yet. None of that was now. Now there was only the library and the fire, and two people sitting across from each other who had found each other in the dark and decided, in their separate, desperate ways, to hold on. It was not the ending Arabella had imagined for herself. It was considerably better.